I'm James Carden. Today I'm pleased to welcome our very first guest, the distinguished scholar and journalist Anatol Lieven. Anatol hardly needs any introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. An industrious writer, to say the very least. Anatol is a senior fellow at America and is currently halfway around the world from where I sit in Washington. He's a professor of international relations at Georgetown University's campus in Qatar. His latest book is Climate Change and the Nation State. More recently, he has appeared in Responsible Statecraft, which is the foreign affairs website of the Quincy Institute. And Anatol also recently offered a terrific essay to the Simone Weil Center's recent conference on the different approaches to the issue of historical memory in the US and Russia. So as regards to Russia and its relations with the US and the West, there's a lot to talk about. The problems in the relationship seem to have several underlying causes. And my own hobby horse in recent years has been with regard to sovereignty. The US and Russia, I think, can paper over our differences, but until the US returns or goes back to accepting and practicing a more Westphalian foreign policy, we're likely to get nowhere. And in your own contribution to the Simone Weil conference, you talked about the role historical memory plays in both countries. And I agree with that. So can we begin by talking about how Russia's living memory, particularly as it concerns the Second World War, shapes the way it interacts with its neighbors and the West today?
The Second World War, I think, is quite central to both to obviously Russian pride, but also for thinking Russians, the ambiguity of modern Russian history. But in a way, I feel that ought to, if only educated Westerners were capable of it, also create a certain empathy between the two sides. Because, of course, there is this fundamental dilemma that this was, without question, not merely the greatest victory at the greatest cost in the whole of Russian history. It was, of course, the greatest cost of any country in any war in the whole of history. And it saved civilization. There is no question at all. It was the Soviet army that defeated the Nazis. Of course, Britain and America helped. But if you look at the disposition of the German forces, if you look at the German casualties, there is no question about this. But on the other hand, of course, the leader at the time was this monstrous criminal, Stalin. And the victory also legitimized his continued rule, thank God only for another 8 years, but also, of course, did lead to the imposition of communist rule on Eastern Europe. One of the tragic results of which, of course, was that what should have been, frankly, and to some extent, if you read the initial speeches by people who were dedicated communists, like Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, even conservatives as well in Britain, there was actually recognition of this colossal sacrifice and this colossal achievement. And of course, there was initially deep gratitude in large parts of Eastern Europe to have been rescued from the Nazi nightmare. But of course, all this was then lost by the Stalinist repression. And of course, the Stalinist repression, which did not, after Stalin's death, at least after the Hungarian uprising, remain at anything the same level, and became, in terms of repression, completely comparable to, American-backed regimes in other parts of the world, but nonetheless has been used ever since to damn not just the Soviet Union, but Russia. And so there is this colossal ambiguity, an ambiguity which is deeply there, and in my view, best expressed and understood and analyzed and described in the greatest Russian novel of the Second World War. In fact, simply the greatest novel of the Second World War anywhere. Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate, Жизнь и судьба. Now, this might appear to be a particularly Russian thing, and of course it is a uniquely Russian experience. But on the other hand, you know, we in the West, and particularly, of course, in the USA, are now having to come to terms with a deeply ambiguous history ourselves. A history of tremendous democratic achievement, a history of tremendous economic achievement and cultural achievement, but which was, to some extent, built on the foundations of a monstrous crime, slavery, which, the legacy of which, of course, in a diminished form, has continued, you know, up to our own day. And, you know, we too are facing two, you know, opposing forces, one of whom is strongly inclined basically to try as much as they now can to ignore the bad sides of the history or to play them down. Another side, however, are inclined simply to, frankly, trash the entire American tradition.
Right. I'm glad that you brought that up, because one of the things that you wrote recently was that another thing that Americans can learn from modern Russian history is the vital importance of a strong central cultural and especially literary tradition. And that seems right to me, but you know, today with the Antifa vigilantes and woke mobs roaming the streets and taking over major newspapers and magazines, we see an effort at canceling historical figures, which seems to me to be a problem, you know, considering if we look at the 19th century, you know, two of the best American writers also happen to be American presidents, Lincoln and Grant. So their statues are being removed and defaced by you know, the mob. And so a country with no common culture isn't really much of a country at all. And it seems that Russian elites understand that, but our own do not.
Well, some of the Russian elites understand it, but in the 1990s, when I was a journalist in Russia, you know, a large part of the liberal intelligentsia was entirely willing to junk the entire Russian tradition, to damn the entire Russian tradition, and frankly, to accept whatever second-hand stuff the West would give it.
There's a very good essay by Andrei Sinyavsky about that, on the Russian intelligentsia, that
yes,
he gave at Columbia in the 1990s about that.
Yeah, and this reminds me also of something I teach my students in terms of national traditions. That great nations are often built around great literary traditions and philosophical traditions. This is essentially what has held China together for 2,500 years. And as you know, China repeatedly broke up, but came back together again because of this core cultural tradition. In medieval Europe, the legends of Charlemagne, around which French literature grew and accreted, were known as the matter of France, you know, which gives you an idea of the centrality of this cultural tradition. Now, of course, the mark of a great cultural tradition, which I think, you know, has been preeminently true of America, but also of Russia, if you look at the, you know, ethnic composition of the great Russian, you know, tradition, at least in the 20th century. Of course, it needs to be open to people of different ethnicities and backgrounds who can join it. But all this talk of decentering strikes me as profoundly dangerous and worrying, because you're left, you pull it to pieces, and in the end you're left with nothing there except, you know, symbolic bits and pieces which have in the end a separatist political purpose, frankly often quite irrespective of their their cultural value or their ability to, to draw people who don't agree with them.
Yeah, it seems to me that you can't really build a common culture based on grievance. That's a very shaky foundation on which to go forward.
We have. I'm a tremendous admirer of Tolstoy, as obviously as anyone who loves literature in general. So is my wife, but as a woman, of course, she has a more skeptical attitude to some of Tolstoy's cultural attitudes. So while immensely revering Tolstoy and believing in his absolute centrality to the Russian literary tradition, I have to say that we also have, my daughter has in her room a large stuffed toy lion, who is known to us as Lieven Nikolaevich. Tolstoy.
I think maybe we'll move on to the role of the media and the role it plays in shaping our perception of Russia. And in my view, in the United States, it's too often shaped by people with an agenda. And I'm often reminded of Machiavelli's warning of how a prince will come to grief if he takes the word of exiles with an agenda. Mm-hmm. I often do this when I read Masha Gessen or Julia Yaffe, or read glowing profiles of Pussy Riot and Alexei Navalny. Now, you recently wrote about Navalny, and it was not a glowing profile. Can you explain to us what Navalny is, what he represents? Is he, I have here the Financial Times from the other day, article claims that his arrest has transformed him into a victim of injustice in a truly national level challenge to Putin. Is that correct?
I think Navalny has become, an important symbol. And he's done so, one must admit, also because of his immense courage. Physical courage is an admirable thing. Courage, determination, in the face of, tremendous threats and odds. But of course, what he has also done is he has, to some degree, come to symbolize a whole set of resentments, anger within Russia, but of a very, varied and inchoate kind, which, does not in itself delegitimize him, but, as I wrote in my piece, anyone who thinks that Navalny is simply a Western-style liberal who in power, if he ever comes to power, which by the way, I don't think he will, but if he were to come to power, would adopt some kind of Western-derived liberal agenda and would agree with the West or the United States in foreign affairs, frankly, has never attended a Navalny rally in Russia and, seen some of the people who are supporting him, and has never, never bothered to study the examples of other people in the past, who our media have built up into tremendous, liberal heroes, only to find that, no, actually they, that doesn't make them bad people either, but it just means that they are politicians of their countries with ambitions and agendas of their own, not derived from our
imagination.
Geography.
Right. If you have kind of a feverish imagination like someone like Michael McFaul, you'll fool yourself into believing that Navalny is, the West's great hope. But it's very clear that Navalny, and he's been very public about this, has backed some of the things that his Western supporters find, most troubling about Vladimir Putin. So he was a supporter of the Russian war in 2008 with Georgia. He wholeheartedly supports the annexation of Crimea, but you don't hear that in the Western press. It doesn't make him a bad guy. His other opinions, however, might, particularly with the language that he's used to describe people from the Caucasus, which we might find, his Western supporters might find objectionable if they bothered to look into it.
Yes, I mean, on Georgia and Crimea, frankly, I mean, any Russian politician who had taken the other side on that would have committed political suicide, given the strength of Russian public feeling on the subject. But for me, yes, I mean, the most troubling thing is that, and this goes back to an absolutely cardinal, ignorant, bigoted belief about Putin in the West, that Putin is some kind of Russian ethnic nationalist. He's not. He's a state nationalist. People who say that do not understand why so many of the Russian minorities feel so much safer with Putin than with possibly a more democratically elected Russian president. They also haven't paid attention to the fact that the governing elites, both ruling the political elites and the economic elites under Putin, have in fact been strikingly multi-ethnic in origin, and this derives from, of course, a very old Russian imperial and Soviet tradition. And by the way, is very well expressed by Putin in an essay that he wrote in 2011, in which he sets out all his beliefs about this very clearly, which it seems none of these analysts have even bothered to read. But that's what I find most troubling about Navalny, this potential element of Russian ethnic nationalism, which, as Putin has said very well, if not particularly about Navalny, but if allowed to really run free, would destroy Russia, given that Russia is a multi-ethnic state, even after the loss of the Soviet Union.
Right, and I think a lot of these Western analysts also miss the significance of Sergei Shoigu, who's the defense minister. So, he's, one can only imagine Navalny's opinion about him. But I think maybe this would be a good time to wrap things up. I really appreciate you coming on and participating in the very first American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord. What would we call this? A podcast or Zoom? Whatever. But anyway, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I stopped recording. Thank